He didn't just forget her. He made sure everyone else did too. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, the kind that cast a soft glow meant to flatter wealth and hide cruelty. And Charlotte Hayes stood just inside the entrance, her heels quiet against the polished marble as conversations swelled and laughter echoed like champagne bubbles rising to the surface, unnoticed and fleeting. Except she wasn't fleeting, not tonight, not anymore, even if no one seemed to realize it yet. And across the room, Daniel Brooks did exactly what she expected. He looked straight through her, as if she were part of the decor, another polished surface reflecting his success. His arm draped casually around a woman in a silver dress who leaned into him with the kind of confidence that came from believing she had replaced something insignificant. And Charlotte watched as Daniel greeted investors, shook hands, accepted praise that once would have belonged to both of them, but now only carried his name. His version of the story, the one where she had quietly disappeared without consequence, without weight, without memory. And when his new partner followed his gaze toward the entrance, her lips curved into a polite but unmistakably dismissive smile, the kind reserved for strangers who didn't quite belong. And Charlotte felt the shift ripple through the room, subtle but sharp, a collective understanding forming without words that she was not part of this world anymore, not at this level, not in this circle. And yet she didn't move, didn't shrink, didn't turn away. Instead, she stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch her face, calm and composed, her posture effortless, as though she hadn't spent years learning how to stand alone again, how to breathe without waiting for permission. And Daniel's eyes flickered back to her for half a second, just long enough to recognize her presence and then dismiss it again, a deliberate choice, a quiet cruelty. And when one of his colleagues asked, "Do you know her?" Daniel gave a small shrug, almost amused, and said, "Someone from a long time ago," before turning back to the conversation as if that settled everything, as if that erased everything. And a few nearby guests chuckled lightly, the sound soft but cutting, and Charlotte heard it all, every word, every pause, every silence that followed. But her expression didn't change, because she wasn't here for them. Not really. She wasn't here to remind Daniel of what he lost or to reclaim anything he thought he owned. She wasn't even here to be seen, not yet. And as a server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, she took one without hesitation, her fingers steady, her gaze drifting briefly to the far end of the ballroom where the stage stood prepared for an announcement no one seemed to fully understand. The air carrying that quiet anticipation that comes before something shifts, something irreversible. And Charlotte checked the time on her watch, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but deliberate, precise, as though she were waiting for a cue only she could hear. And somewhere behind the music and the laughter, beneath the polished surface of wealth and arrogance, something was already in motion, something Daniel Brooks had no idea was coming. And Charlotte Hayes wasn't here to interrupt his world. She was here to end it without ever raising her voice. There was a time when Charlotte Hayes would have left the moment she felt unwelcome, when silence felt like defeat instead of control. But that version of her belonged to another life, one measured in shared calendars and quiet sacrifices that never made it into conversations like the ones unfolding around her now. And as the music shifted into something softer, almost elegant, her mind drifted not to the room she stood in, but to a smaller place years ago, a narrow apartment just under 900 square feet where the paint had started to fade near the windows and the heat clicked loudly every winter night, where Daniel Brooks used to sit at a scratched wooden table with numbers spread across printed pages, frustration written across his face as he chased a future that refused to come quickly enough. And Charlotte had been there, always there, bringing him coffee that had gone cold more times than she could count, listening to his ideas, refining them, encouraging him when investors said no and doors stayed closed. She remembered the way he used to look at her back then, not with admiration exactly, but with dependence, like she was part of the foundation he stood on, something steady, something he never imagined could disappear. And she had believed in him with a quiet certainty that did not need recognition, had trusted that one day when everything came together, when the numbers aligned and the right people said yes, he would look back at her and see the journey they built together. But success had a way of rewriting memory, and when the meetings moved from small offices to glass towers overlooking the city, When the suits became sharper and the conversations more exclusive, Charlotte noticed the shift not in what Daniel said, but in what he stopped saying. Fewer introductions, fewer acknowledgments, until one day she realized she was no longer included in the story at all, reduced to a detail that no longer fit the image he wanted to present. And the day he left had not been loud or dramatic. There were no raised voices, no broken promises spoken out loud, just a quiet statement that things had changed, that he needed something different now, something that aligned with where he was going, as if she had not been the one who helped him get there. And Charlotte had listened, her hands folded in her lap, absorbing each word not as a shock, but as confirmation of something she had already begun to understand, that love, when built on imbalance, eventually turns into absence. And she had walked away from that life with nothing that could be measured in dollars, no grand settlement, no dramatic closure, just the weight of everything she had given and the silence that followed. And standing in the ballroom now, years later, surrounded by the same kind of people who once overlooked her, Charlotte did not feel anger or regret, only clarity. Because what they saw when they looked at her was still the woman who had been left behind, the one who had quietly disappeared. But what they could not see, what Daniel refused to recognize even now, was that she had not disappeared at all. She had simply stepped out of a narrative that was too small to hold what she was becoming. And as her fingers lightly traced the rim of the champagne glass, her gaze returned to the stage, steady and unhurried, because the past was no longer something she carried. It was something she had already outgrown, and the room, with all its polished certainty, was about to learn that the woman they thought they understood had never truly belonged to their version of the story in the first place. The music swelled just enough to mask the subtle shift in the room as more guests began drifting toward the stage, their conversations lowering into a collective murmur shaped by curiosity rather than interest, because whatever announcement was coming had been carefully kept just out of reach. And Charlotte Hayes watched it all unfold with the same quiet composure she had carried since she stepped inside, her shoulders relaxed, her expression untouched by the undercurrent of judgment that still lingered around her like a faint echo. And when Daniel Brooks finally allowed himself to look in her direction again, this time it lasted a second longer, not out of recognition, but out of confusion, as if something about her presence no longer aligned with the version of her he had stored away in his mind. And he leaned slightly toward the woman at his side, saying something under his breath that made her glance over with a sharper, more deliberate look, her eyes scanning Charlotte from head to toe as if searching for proof that she did not belong. And Charlotte met that gaze without resistance, without challenge, simply holding it long enough for the silence between them to become uncomfortable, before turning her attention back to the stage, because she was not here to compete for space in a room that had already decided her value. She was here for something else entirely. And across the ballroom, a group of executives began to gather near the front, their posture shifting into something more formal, more attentive, and the subtle change did not go unnoticed by Daniel, who straightened his jacket almost instinctively, adjusting his cufflinks as though preparing for an opportunity he believed was his to claim, his confidence returning in small, practiced gestures, the kind that had once impressed Charlotte when they meant something real, but now felt rehearsed, detached from the substance they once carried. And as he moved closer to the stage, positioning himself just within reach of the spotlight without appearing too eager, Charlotte remained where she was, unmoved, her glass untouched in her hand, her focus unwavering, because distance, in moments like this, was not weakness. It was perspective. And the announcer's voice finally broke through the room, calm and measured, requesting everyone's attention as the lights dimmed just slightly, enough to draw every eye forward, and a quiet anticipation settled over the crowd, the kind that tightens the air without anyone noticing. And Daniel lifted his chin just a fraction, ready, expectant, certain that whatever came next would pull him further into the circle he had spent years building his way into, while Charlotte simply exhaled, slow and steady, her gaze fixed on the stage with a clarity that did not waver, because unlike everyone else in that room, she was not waiting to be recognized. She was waiting for the moment when recognition would no longer matter. And somewhere in the subtle rhythm of the evening, beneath the polished confidence and carefully constructed appearances, the balance had already begun to shift, quietly, irreversibly. And the only person who seemed to understand that was the one they had all already chosen to overlook. The lights dimmed just enough to quiet the room. Not completely, but enough for conversations to soften into whispers, and Charlotte Hayes felt the shift like a change in air pressure, subtle yet undeniable, the kind that signals something is about to unfold whether anyone is ready for it or not. And as the announcer stepped fully into view beneath the soft glow of the stage lights, his voice steady and composed, Charlotte allowed herself a single breath that carried more memory than tension. Because this moment, unlike everything before it, was not uncertain, it was earned, and while the rest of the room leaned forward in anticipation, she leaned inward, into a version of herself that had been quietly built long before tonight, long before the invitations, the polished floors, the carefully curated crowd, and for a brief second her mind drifted not to Daniel or the room behind her, but to mornings that began before sunrise, when the world was still quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of a coffee machine in a small office that no one prestigious ever visited, where Charlotte had spent months, then years, learning how to rebuild without recognition, how to understand numbers and systems that once felt distant, how to sit in meetings where no one expected her to speak, and yet still listen with an intensity that turned silence into advantage. She remembered the long hours spent reviewing reports that others overlooked, catching details that did not belong, asking questions that did not get answered right away, but eventually shifted outcomes in ways no one traced back to her. And she remembered the first time she met Alexander Vaughn, not in a grand introduction, not under lights like these, but across a modest conference table with a view of nothing more than a parking lot, where he had watched her speak with a calm precision that did not seek approval, and instead of interrupting, instead of asserting his presence the way powerful men often did, he simply listened, his expression unreadable, as if measuring not her confidence but her clarity, and when the meeting ended, he did not praise her or offer anything immediate. He only said, "You see things most people miss," before leaving the room as quietly as he had entered, and Charlotte had not chased that moment or tried to define it. She had simply continued, day after day, building something that did not need validation to exist, and now, standing in a ballroom filled with people who believed they understood power, she realized how little of it had ever been visible, because the real shifts, the ones that mattered, never announced themselves. They happened in overlooked spaces, in decisions made without applause, in resilience that did not perform for anyone. And as the announcer's voice began to outline the significance of the evening, mentioning transitions, legacy, and a future direction that would shape more than just one company, Charlotte's gaze remained steady, her fingers no longer tracing the edge of the glass, but resting calmly at her side. Because this was not the beginning of something new. It was the unveiling of something that had already been set in motion long ago, something Daniel Brooks had walked away from without ever realizing what he was leaving behind. And as the room leaned further into expectation, Charlotte stood exactly where she needed to be, not closer, not farther, just enough to witness the moment when everything they believed about her would quietly begin to unravel. The announcer's voice carried with deliberate calm, each word measured, each pause intentional, as if the weight of what he was about to reveal required the room to slow down, to listen more carefully than it had before, and Charlotte Hayes felt the subtle shift ripple outward, not dramatic, not immediate, but unmistakable, like the first movement of something too large to ignore once it began. And around her, the energy in the ballroom tightened, conversations fading completely now, replaced by attentive silence as eyes turned fully toward the stage, and Daniel Brooks stood near the front with quiet confidence, his posture straight, his expression composed in the way of someone who believed he understood how moments like this unfolded, how recognition worked, how proximity to power often translated into opportunity, and he adjusted his stance slightly, positioning himself just within the line of sight of the executives gathering near the podium, as though preparing to be acknowledged, or at least noticed, and beside him, his companion mirrored that anticipation, her gaze fixed forward with a faint smile that suggested certainty rather than curiosity. But Charlotte remained where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, her presence grounded, her attention steady, because she did not need to move closer to something that was already moving toward her. and as the announcer continued, his words began to take shape, referencing legacy, transition, and a future direction that would redefine the structure of an empire that had remained largely unchanged for decades, and a name surfaced briefly, not fully introduced, but enough to stir recognition among those who understood the significance of it. Vaughn, spoken with a quiet respect that carried through the room like a signal, and Daniel's focus sharpened at that, his expression shifting just slightly, not surprise, but heightened interest, because this was the kind of moment that mattered, the kind that could elevate someone already positioned close enough to reach for it. And Charlotte noticed the change, not because she was watching him directly, but because she had learned long ago how to read a room without needing to follow every movement, how to sense where attention gathered and where it fractured. And as the announcer paused, allowing the weight of the name to settle, Charlotte's gaze lifted just enough to meet the stage lights without flinching, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, because what was unfolding now was not a surprise to her. It was a continuation, the visible part of something that had been carefully aligned long before tonight. And in that quiet space between words, between expectation and revelation, the distance between who she had been and who she was now disappeared entirely, leaving only the present moment, clear and undeniable. And somewhere near the front, Daniel shifted again, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal that even he could feel it now, that something about this evening was not following the path he had assumed. And Charlotte, still untouched by the tension building around her, allowed the faintest trace of a smile to settle in her expression, not for anyone else to see, not for recognition, but for herself, because for the first time in a long time, the room was no longer defining her place within it. It was slowly, quietly adjusting to hers. The pause stretched just long enough to make people shift their weight, to make confidence feel slightly less certain. And Charlotte Hayes recognized that moment for what it was, the exact space where expectations begin to crack, where certainty quietly loses its grip before anyone is willing to admit it. And on stage the announcer adjusted the microphone with a small, almost unnoticeable movement before continuing, his tone unchanged but his words now more precise, more deliberate, as he spoke about transition not as a possibility, but as a decision already made. And a subtle ripple passed through the executives gathered near the front, a glance exchanged here, a slight nod there, signals too small for most to notice, but clear enough for those who understood how power moved beneath the surface. And Daniel Brooks felt it too, though not in a way he could define, his confidence still intact but no longer effortless, his attention sharpening as if trying to catch up to something that had already begun without him. And he leaned slightly toward a colleague, whispering a question that did not receive an immediate answer, which in itself was an answer. And Charlotte, standing at a distance that now felt intentional rather than incidental, watched the shift unfold with quiet clarity, her focus no longer on the crowd but on the space just beyond them, where a figure had begun to move toward the stage, unhurried, unannounced, yet instantly commanding attention without asking for it. And the name did not need to be spoken yet, because recognition arrived before introduction, carried in the way conversations stopped completely this time, in the way posture straightened across the room, in the way even Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that he understood the significance of who was about to step into the light. And Alexander Vaughn did not rush his entrance. He did not acknowledge the room immediately. Instead, he walked with the kind of calm that comes from never needing to prove presence, his gaze steady, his movements measured, and when he reached the stage, the announcer stepped aside without hesitation, a silent transfer of focus that required no explanation, and for a moment the room held its breath, waiting, anticipating, aligning itself around a center it had long recognized, but rarely seen this closely. And Daniel straightened further, adjusting his stance with renewed certainty, as if proximity alone might connect him to what was unfolding, while beside him, his companion's expression shifted from confidence to careful attention, her smile fading into something more neutral, more observant. And Charlotte remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But there was a subtle difference now, something almost imperceptible, as if the distance between her and the moment had finally closed. And when Alexander's gaze lifted from the stage and moved across the room, it did not wander, It did not search. It moved with quiet intention until it found exactly where it was meant to land, and in that brief, silent connection, something shifted that no announcement had yet explained, something that existed entirely outside the understanding of everyone else in the room. And Charlotte did not react, did not acknowledge it outwardly. But her stillness carried a different weight now, not anticipation, not uncertainty, but arrival. And while the rest of the room waited for words to define what was happening, the truth had already begun to reveal itself in ways far more powerful than anything that could be spoken aloud. Alexander Vaughn did not raise his voice when he began to speak, yet the room leaned in as if pulled by something stronger than sound, his words calm, deliberate, carrying the kind of authority that did not rely on volume. And as he spoke about legacy, about continuity, about decisions made not for the present, but for what would outlast it, Charlotte Hayes stood exactly where she had been, her stillness now no longer overlooked, but quietly anchoring the space around her. And Daniel Brooks listened with growing focus, his earlier certainty narrowing into something more calculated, his mind moving quickly, connecting possibilities, positioning himself within whatever outcome was about to be revealed, because this was the moment that mattered, the moment that could redefine his standing. And he adjusted his jacket once more, a small habitual gesture, grounding himself in the confidence he had built over years of rising through rooms just like this one. But then Alexander paused. Not long, just enough to let the weight of his next words settle before they were spoken. And when he continued, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly, no longer general, no longer abstract, but precise, intentional, as he spoke of a successor, not as a concept but as a reality, someone already chosen, someone already prepared. And the room reacted not with noise but with silence, the kind that sharpens attention instead of breaking it. And Daniel felt it immediately, his focus tightening, his posture lifting just slightly as anticipation replaced assumption. Because this was it. This was where names were spoken, where futures were defined. And for a brief second, he allowed himself to believe that he was close enough to be part of that conversation, that his proximity, his effort, his timing might align in his favor. But Alexander did not look toward the front row, did not acknowledge the cluster of executives waiting near the stage. Instead, his gaze moved slowly, deliberately, across the room, bypassing expectation, bypassing hierarchy, until it reached the one place no one else had thought to look. And in that moment, something fractured, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, because when attention shifts away from where it is expected to land, it forces everything else to realign. And Charlotte felt the weight of that gaze again, not as pressure, not as surprise, but as confirmation. And around her, subtle movements began to ripple outward, heads turning, eyes following the direction Alexander had chosen, confusion flickering across faces that had been so certain just moments before. And Daniel noticed it too, the shift in attention, the redirection he had not anticipated. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty touched his expression, faint but present, as he followed the line of sight that no longer pointed toward him. And Charlotte did not move, did not step forward, did not claim anything that had not yet been spoken. She simply stood there, composed, grounded, as the room slowly began to recognize what it had failed to see. And in the space between expectation and realization, where everything feels suspended just before it changes, Charlotte Hayes was no longer invisible. She was inevitable. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, bending slowly as realization began to settle into the room, because Alexander Vaughn had not yet spoken a name, and yet his gaze had already said more than any announcement could contain. And Charlotte Hayes felt the weight of that moment not as pressure but as alignment, as if every quiet step she had taken over the years had led precisely here. And around her, the room began to turn, not dramatically, but in fragments, a glance here, a second look there, whispers forming without sound as people followed the direction of something they could not yet explain. And Daniel Brooks stood frozen for half a second longer than usual, his confidence no longer guiding him, his instincts searching for ground that suddenly felt less certain. And when Alexander finally spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that cut clean through the air, not louder, not sharper, just undeniable, as he said that legacy was not inherited by proximity, not granted by association, but entrusted to those who had already proven they could carry it without recognition. And the words did not point forward toward the expected, they redirected entirely. And in that subtle redirection, the room shifted fully, because now there was no mistaking where this was going. And Charlotte did not step forward immediately. She did not rush to meet the moment. Instead, she allowed it to reach her, because power, the kind that endures, does not chase attention, it commands it by standing still. And when Alexander turned his body slightly, not toward the executives near him, not toward Daniel, but toward the far side of the room where Charlotte stood, the distance between them seemed to dissolve, not physically, but in meaning, and a quiet ripple passed through the crowd, sharper this time, more visible, as heads turned fully, conversations abandoned completely, and for the first time that evening, Charlotte was no longer part of the background. She was the center of something no one had prepared for, and Daniel followed that movement instinctively, his gaze landing where everyone else's had already begun to settle. And when he saw her standing there, unchanged, composed, not surprised, not uncertain, something in his expression faltered, not dramatically, but enough to break the illusion he had been holding on to. And Alexander extended a single, measured gesture, not exaggerated, not theatrical, simply an open acknowledgement that required no explanation. And in that gesture, everything became clear, not just to the room, but to Daniel, to everyone who had overlooked her, because this was not an introduction, it was a recognition that had been delayed. And Charlotte finally moved, one step forward, calm, unhurried, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor as the space around her parted without instruction, without resistance. And the closer she came, the quieter the room became, until even the smallest movement felt amplified. And Daniel stood where he was, unable to reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had carried for so long. Because the woman he had dismissed was not returning to his world, she had already moved beyond it. And as Charlotte reached the edge of the stage, she did not look at him, did not acknowledge the past that now felt distant and irrelevant, her focus steady, her presence unwavering. Because this moment was not about proving anything, it was about revealing what had always been true. And when she finally stood beside Alexander Vaughn, the room did not need another explanation, because everything they had failed to see was now standing right in front of them, undeniable, unspoken, and entirely beyond their control. No one spoke when she reached the stage, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret. The truth had already settled into the room long before a single formal introduction could be made. And Charlotte Hayes stood beside Alexander Vaughn, with the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she entered, her presence neither exaggerated nor diminished by the weight of what had just been revealed. And Alexander did not place a hand on her shoulder or announce her. With dramatic emphasis, he simply stepped half a pace back, a subtle shift that said everything without needing to say it, a gesture of recognition, of trust, of transfer, and the room understood, not all at once, but in waves, as realization moved from one face to another, from disbelief to acceptance, from certainty to silence. And Daniel Brooks remained where he was, his posture still, his expression fixed in that fragile space between understanding and refusal, because what he was seeing did not fit into any version of the story he had constructed, not the one where he had moved on, not the one where she had been left behind, not the one where he had risen beyond the past that once included her. And yet there she was, not returning, not reclaiming, simply existing, at a level he had never imagined she could reach without him. And the distance between them, once defined by absence, was now defined by something far more permanent, something that could not be closed or rewritten. And Charlotte did not look toward him, not out of avoidance, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing left in that direction that required her attention. Her gaze remained forward, steady, aligned with the path she had built long before this moment made it visible. And as Alexander spoke again, this time with clarity that removed any remaining doubt, acknowledging her not as a successor to be introduced, but as a leader already established, the final piece fell into place, not loudly, not with applause, but with a quiet acceptance that settled deeper than any reaction could reach. And the room adjusted, not to her presence, but to her position. Conversations that would come later already beginning to reshape themselves around her name, her role, her future. And Daniel felt it all without moving. The shift not just in the room, but in himself, as the certainty he had carried for so long dissolved into something he could not control, because this was not a moment he could step into, not a narrative he could redirect. It was simply a reality he had to witness, and Charlotte, standing at the center of it without ever demanding to be there, allowed a small, almost imperceptible breath to leave her, not relief, not victory, but completion, because this was never about proving anything to anyone else. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed to be seen to exist. And when she finally turned slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the exit beyond the stage, it was with the same calm intention she had carried from the beginning, her steps measured, her presence leaving an impression that did not fade when she moved. And the room remained still for a moment longer, as if adjusting to the absence of something it had only just begun to understand. And Daniel stood there, surrounded by everything he thought he had gained, realizing too late that the one thing he had dismissed without hesitation was the one thing he would never be able to reach again. And Charlotte Hayes did not take anything from him. She did not return to change his world. She simply became someone who existed entirely beyond it. And in that quiet, undeniable truth, the story ended not with confrontation, but with distance, not with noise, but with a silence that said everything words never could.